The whole thing is ridiculous. And the good news is we don't need to talk about that documentary anymore. People are going to watch it. It's got the music and it's beautiful, and all the fancy graphs and everything looks great. We can leave that. The bad news is we do have to talk about another documentary that came out last year, all about the blue zones. This is a
Oh,
topic that is very near and dear to both you and me. I've done several episodes talking about the blue zones, and in particular, the documentary that came out about that by Dan Buettner. I know this has been a passion project of yours as well, and you've been deep diving into the blue zones. We would love to hear an update of some of the things you've learned about the blue zones themselves.
yeah. Well, I am just at the start actually of my serious research on the blue zones. So you probably know about this more than I do, but I will just, as a starting point, say, I spent a lot of time analyzing the Mediterranean diet for a chapter in my book, and it's very, very clear that that is not a low meat diet by any stretch of the imagination. So, not in Greece, not in Italy. And the more meat that people have eaten in Spain, Italy, and Greece, the healthier they have become over time. So, I mean, the better cardiovascular risk outcomes that has been reported in those populations. So that's just my starting point, and I knew how much the data in Crete, the island of Crete, had been distorted. So when I started looking into the blue zones, you realize like, well, in Icaria, uh, actually, there's people who've gone to visit that. Like all Greek cuisine, it's very high in goat and lamb. Those are the main traditional meats in Greek cuisine. Well, the blue zones folks, when they came to ask about what people were eating, they asked them about beef and pork, because those are the Western meats. They didn't ask them about lamb or veal. So there was like no collection of the data of the most common meats eaten on the island of Icaria. So I mean, just that. I think we all know that in Okinawa, Okinawa meant the island of pork, and there was a huge amount of pork consumption, and that the diet that was sampled there was, occurred during the occupation of the American forces, was very an unusual period of time on the island, and it was not representative of their traditional diet. I think one of the most interesting things I found was when I went back and looked at the original publications that had come out before Dan Buettner's book was published. So it was published like in 2005. There were no peer-reviewed papers at all in the literature when that book was came out. There were only two articles, not peer-reviewed, part of sort of an encyclopedia, a book, but you don't get peer reviewed in a book. And one was on Icaria, and I think the other one maybe on Sardinia, but no data for any of the other so-called blue zones. So they really, and they've been scrambling to try to publish papers since then, but basically they came up with this concept, and it became a huge commercial concept that has made them all very wealthy, these original investigators, but especially Dan Buettner. And again, it was like PR, books, articles, all kinds of publicity, but no real science behind it. So, and then there's a really interesting article on the longevity data, which it's by this guy who's a demographer. He works in the Department of Demography at the University of Oxford, and he has on preprint. His name is Saul Newman, and I spoke to him at length. He's has a preprint paper that goes into all the problems of the validity of the longevity data. I mean, this is probably all old news to you, Casey, but so the death certificates are not reliable by any stretch of the imagination. There's so much fraud in the death certificates. And his theory, which I think he proves pretty effectively, is that especially in poor regions where to start getting a pension creates huge incentives for people to say they're older than they are. And most of these age records are self-reported. They're not validated by church records or birth records. So And so there's a huge incentive to say you're older than you are. He realized this when he realized in Italy that people were turning 114, 115. And he's like, because they had started saying that they were old enough to get a pension, back when they were in their late 30s or whatever. So when authorities go through and try to clean up their records on life, on their death certificates or their records, they see huge amounts of fraud, which he also documents. And in fact, in the U.S., where the blue zone is the Loma Linda, California, which is where the Seventh Day Adventist Church is, and they apparently all have a vegetarian diet. They're a very wealthy population, but when the Center for Disease Control did their survey, an objective survey by the government of their lifespan, their average life expectancy was middle of the range, not exceptional, not what the Seventh Day Adventists themselves were reporting. So, or what the Blue Zone folks found. So, and so it's not like the longevity data is really not reliable. And I guess we were talking before we started recording, but it's such a cherry picked set of locations, the blue zones. I mean, the population that lives the longest and also are the biggest meat eaters in the world are people in Hong Kong. And that's still true today. Most meat consumption in the world, longest life expectancy. The Mormons, who live just as long as the Seventh Day Adventists, big meat eaters. So, I documented in my book, like the North American Indians who survived almost exclusively on buffalo. They, their death certificates probably not that reliable, but reported by anthropologists to have remarkable numbers of centenarians. So, I mean, I think that the best you can say about the blue zones, even if everything they claim is true, is that they're cherry picked. They're not representative of the longest lived people exclusively in the world.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's pretty much all I know so far.
That's pretty good. It's a good start. I can confirm I live here in the Salt Lake Valley of Utah where lots of Mormons live. I was brought up Mormon. You don't shun meat. We always had meat. We had it in a mixed diet, but we always had meat. And the longevity numbers are exactly the same as the Seventh Day Adventists. I know you're just kind of starting on digging into this, but the story that I heard was that it was those like two demographers who were kind of getting started. They started identifying a few places in the world where they thought people lived longer. Then Dan Buettner, National Geographic, got involved with it, identified the fifth blue zone in Loma Linda, which has nothing to do with the others, since this is a Seventh-day Adventist retirement community, not a place where people were born, they live, they die in the same place, isolated communities. This is a wealthy population with an ideological slant towards, again, plant-based diets. And that is what was allowed to go forward. And that was that commercialization of the blue zone. Is that kind of the way you understand it?
Well, yes, that is, I think, the trajectory. The original demographers did own part of the patent, so they were incentivized to find what they found, and they all made a lot of money because they sold the Blue Zones company to the Seventh Day Adventist Church a few years ago for, I think, I want to say 150 million. I might have that wrong. One thing the Seventh Day Adventist Church is really good at is scrubbing the internet of all information, so it's not that easy to come by. But so those folks all did incredibly well. They made a lot of money. Before, when Dan Buettner ran the Blue Zones, when I went on to look at the website, it was him and all his like 6 other Buettners who were running it. So it was clearly like a family industry. And I think it was probably always pretty closely tied to the Seventh Day Adventist Church, but I think the fact that the church now bought that brand is shows you, like, I mean, and they're ideological, they're religiously motivated. They have a belief that unless everybody eats a vegan diet, then there will be no second coming. So for them, it's a matter of urgency that they get everybody to adopt a blue zone diet. One of the things that Belinda Fetke, who's done a lot of the foundational work in this whole area, she's from Tasmania, she found that that at a recent mayor's conference, that something like 29 cities had signed on to the blue zones, made a blue zones pledge to have their cities become blue zones, and then you invest like millions of dollars to shift your whole community to become more plant-based. So one of my plans is to go check in on some of those communities and see how they're doing.
Ah, interesting. Yeah, I heard the number was like $6 million to get your city blue zone accredited. So Fort Worth, Texas, might be on your list of places to go visit. Fort Worth, Texas, is a blue zone.
Is that right? Wow, that is not a place I would have expected.
It's again, it's an accreditation, and so they come in. I think they talk about like public spaces and try to make sure that you have plans for like parks and walking spaces, and then it's education around plant based. But I think that's all they do. It's like a consultation kind of fee that they come in and teach the city how to be more blue
Yeah.
zone, you know, whatever, and they get that accreditation. So it's yeah, it's they're making a lot of money from what I can tell.
Yeah. I think that, one of the deceptive things about the blue zones is that the finding was that it was, I mean, there's maybe 10 things that contribute that they say contribute to longevity, having to have, having a community, having a spiritual practice, having exercise, doing things that reduce stress in your life, having daily social interactions, all these things, getting good sleep, like all these things, nothing to do with diet. But then the the diet one is quite accentuated when they go out and preach to communities. Like it's not that easy to get it's not that easy to get a city to like put in a whole lot of new parks and walking spaces, right? But what you can do, and this has been part of the plant-based message around the world, like the one thing you can do to get healthier, help the environment, like the easy thing to do is just reduce meat or cut out meat altogether. Like that's the easy thing you can do. It's like recycle a can, cut out meat. Those are the easy things you do because you don't know what to do about oil and gas on the planet and airline, emissions. Like what can we each of us do? So it's pushing onto the consumer the one thing that we feel like we can reasonably feasibly do in our own lives. And I think people really respond to that messaging.
Yeah,
I'm sure you've seen it. Like
it's
that's
empowering.
feel like they're doing good. The
Yeah, it's
halo over your
the
head.
halo. Yep, the same halo you have over the rack of ribs on the cover of your
Yeah.
book.
Right.